Good afternoon. I'm honored to open today's webinar, Terrorism and Democracy Perspective Across Israel, UK, and the EU. We have three distinguished guests today, Professor Gabriel Ben Dor from University of Haifa, Israel, Professor Christian Kaunert from University of South Wales, and Professor Sarah Leonard from University of West of England. Before we begin, I would ask you to turn off your cameras and microphones. We will have time for questions later, so please feel free to write down your questions in the chat. The first speaker will be Professor Gabi Ben Dor. Gabriel Ben Dor is a professor of political science and the director of national security studies in the School of Political Science at the University of Haifa in Israel. He served in the past as director of the university and also held the post of chairman of the Department of Political Science. Professor Ben Dor is also a past president of the Israel Political Science Association, and he served as a senior advisor on strategic affairs to the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Professor Ben Dor was until recently the director of the graduate study program at the National Defense College, which is the highest course of the studies in the Israeli Defense Forces. He was also the founder and director of the National Security Studies Center at the University of Haifa, which is one of the leading research institutes on matters related to defense, security, and strategy in Israel. He lectured for over 20 years at the Royal College of Defense Studies in London, England, one of the leading institutions for national security affairs in the world. Gabriel Ben Dor has published 7 books and over 120 articles in scholarly journals on Middle East politics, the Arab-Israeli conflict, national security affairs, strategic studies, ethnic problems, and political theory. Gabi, please.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. I enjoyed this introduction immensely. It's not every day that good things are said about me, particularly by a former student of mine. It's a real pleasure. I also remember with some sorrow that we had this conference scheduled for late February, and we had to cancel it due to the suspicions that the pandemic is more serious than it seemed. And this is the first major international conference I'm taking part on via the computer. So I think it's somehow symbolic of all the things that have passed. My final preliminary comment is that even though I was advising, so to speak, the Israeli Ministry of Defense, it doesn't mean that they listened to my advice. And often I felt that I was just writing papers for nobody's particular attention, but that's the way when it is when you are an advisor. Now I'm going to speak about a perspective and 2 things to be said about that. One, it's not the Israeli perspective, it's an Israeli perspective. As you know, Israel is a wide open society with a lot of partisanship, a lot of controversy, a lot of debate about everything. So there is no Israeli perspective. There is no one Israeli perspective. There are many, and mine is just one of many. Secondly, what is a perspective? A perspective is a way of looking at things. I don't really have a full-fledged theory of what to do about terrorism, how to defeat terrorism, how to get rid of the problem once and for all. I'm going to offer some diagnosis as to why we have this problem, some ways of tackling it, some assessment of how well we are doing, if at all, and some advice, but very, very modest, very humble advice for the future from the point of view of someone who cares about democracy, somebody who cares about an open society, yet wishes to tackle terrorism bravely and consistently. I'm also sympathetic to other countries in the same situation, particularly the democracies in Western Europe are struggling with this problem bravely, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. I think talking about this openly and frankly and creatively makes a big deal of difference perhaps in the future. I've written this up in a presentation and a PowerPoint presentation, which I will make available to the organizers if people wish to take a look at it in case we don't have time to discuss everything I would like to discuss. So now I'm going to present this in this way. And let me start. So of this little countering extremism, fanaticism, and terrorism, EFT. Why? Because terrorism doesn't happen just like that. People are led to terrorism through these channels of first becoming extremists, then become fanatical about it, and finally deteriorating to terrorism. First comment is that this phenomenon, unfortunately, is here to stay. EFT, that's what I will use as the generic term. Okay? Extremism, fanaticism, terrorism has been around for centuries, and it is well known in history. Its examples abound literally since time immemorial. I think that EFT is just more intensive in our times for technological, logistical, and social reasons. And all these reasons will remain with us in the foreseeable future. EFT is not only going to stay, but it's going to be exacerbated in all likelihood, given certain trends in our society, which we will take a look at just now. I think, first of all, it pays. EFT pays because terrorists get huge publicity beyond all proportion to other forms of violence or disaster. There is a major traffic accident which kills 17 people. It's page 46 in the paper. If there's a terrorist attack killing 5 people, it's page 1. That makes a difference to the terrorists. Secondly, there is nothing more effective in having an impact psychologically and sociologically than violent radicalism. The media love it in their own way, and they give it plenty of exposure. Terrorists then enjoy the fact that their violence have a special status aiming at the very heart of society. They hit you where it hurts. We have huge population movements at the moment and massive demographic dislocation, and they create a fertile ground for EFT. Entire populations are leaving countries in the Middle East, in certain parts of Africa, migrating across the Mediterranean into Western Europe mostly. There are also other movements in Latin America, to the US and so on, but I'm more concerned at the moment with the Middle East and Europe. So there's massive dislocation. There's also, as a result, and not only as a result, there's relative deprivation, which is often coupled with ethnic, racial, and religious tension. This is likely to lead to instances of EFT. Finally, contemporary information technology makes mobilization and recruitment of terrorists easier than ever before, as we have seen in the case of ISIS. It's an excellent case study. And then we have contributing factors. There is, I think, some of you might not like these comments of mine, so please forgive me if I speak bluntly. There is a sense of self-confidence in several democratic societies in the West, as if democracy is just one of those things which is not particularly important, not particularly justified, not particularly great compared to other forms of governance. There are, of course, in democracies, habits of compromise, even with enemies. So you compromise at times with terrorists and people who support them. There is an intellectual trend in universities and such of what we might call postmodern thinking, which grants legitimacy to almost any and all kinds of narratives, national, ethnic, and social. Everybody is right and everybody is correct if they say that they are deprived and they are persecuted and somehow they have complaints, and therefore the complaints are justified. There's a permissive educational system in addition. And finally, there's a weakness of alternative ideologies among the relative populations and the relevant populations. In the case of Middle Eastern migrants, ideas of socialism, democratic liberalism and such are not attractive anymore for various reasons. And so extremist religious ideologies, which don't have to, but which might lead to terrorism, are much more popular. We have spoken already about the movement of populations, and this has become very, very easy now in some parts of the world, especially in Europe, because of the Schengen Agreement and such. And all in all, the ideas of the EU of trying to put an end to boundaries are great ideas to support from my point of view as somebody who believes in liberal democratic ideas, but they also appeal to terrorists who can move around the continent much easier than ever before. It is easy also to export EFT, and so on and so forth. It's just easier by way of technology. We have already commented on that. Finally, we have to comment that cooperation between EFT movements, between various terrorist movements and organizations, is often more intensive and effective than among governmental and security agencies. It is easier for the terrorists to cooperate than for the people who oppose them in governance all over the democratic countries. A huge problem is safe havens. Transnational terrorism feeds on these certain centers, core areas, and so on. Their terrorists and their mentors are physically secure and supported, and they can escape the law, the countries where they commit their crimes. Very important states such as Iran are involved in this kind of activity, sometimes quite openly. There is also territory still controlled in complete opposition to what you might read in the newspapers. There is territory still controlled by the Islamic State, ISIS, in Syria, Iraq, and even beyond countries such as Libya, certain countries in Africa. And they pose at the challenges to counter EFT activities across borders. There is also hybrid terrorism. There are terrorist organizations which are also at least in partial control of states or quasi-states, as is the case with Hamas in Gaza, which in some ways is a state and a legitimate government, in some ways a terrorist organization, same with the Hezbollah in Lebanon and so on. Not to mention again Libya. Domestic social imperatives are very important to study. EFT, from my point of view, is not only a security problem. Indeed, it is not even primarily a matter for and of security. It is a social and psychological phenomenon to be dealt with on all the levels of education, ideology, and socialization, which is to say the culture of habits in social intercourse. As such, EFT is a comprehensive problem for a democratic society, necessitating, for example, interfaith dialogue and working with communal leadership on the need to play by the rules. So then what is the problem with all this? The problem is this. Radical thinking is almost inevitable, and it's fine. I think radicalism is not the problem. Radical thinking about social and political problems is and of itself legitimate, perhaps even desirable if it leads to peaceful dissent. I think it is something which has to do with the health of a democratic society. But extremism, which denies the legitimacy of a democratic society, of a democratically elected government and the democratic rules of the game, is the problem, as this is what tends to lead to violence and terrorism. So let's distinguish between the two. When does terrorism become just that terrorism? Well, the American definition of terrorism officially is as follows: the unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof, in furtherance of political or social objectives. In Israel, there is a draft law about terrorism being considered by the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, which identifies 3 dimensions of terrorism. First, motivation, which has to be ideological, diplomatic, nationalist, or religious. Secondly, the goal, the objective, is to create public panic or to convince the government to make a decision or to prevent it from making a decision. And finally, there's a matter of harm, actual damage, caused to a person physically or to his or her liberty or to public safety or health, seriously injuring a person or a public or the religious sites and figures. How do you counter this? Many ways of countering have been entertained, considered, and tried. I think there is no clear set of lessons from this. There is no single paradigm saying what is to be done, what are the boundaries of what can be done. In general, there is no accepted comprehensive set of rules even. I think that we may speak of still soft and hard approaches. And let's take a quick look at these. Soft approaches would involve diplomacy, negotiation, and please remember that democracies like to negotiate. Democracy is to a large extent about negotiating, bargaining, and compromising. Social reform, intelligence. All these take time, and they often try the patience of democratic publics. Yet, in the long run, they might work better than the hard approaches, especially if the latter are adopted on their own without a soft component. So the hard approaches then would include a range of security measures, law enforcement options as such, military options, including preemption, both at home and abroad, covert action and special operations, and so on and so forth. Please make a distinction between law enforcement and military. That's an important point which I would like to expound on for a minute or two. From my point of view, from my perspective, the right perspective, the right paradigm, the right lens, the right microscope for which you want to view the problem is a law enforcement option and not a military option. In other words, the police know how to deal with terrorism much better than the military. The military fight wars. Police enforce the law. They take a good look at criminal activities. They know how to work with people who are on the boundaries between lawful and unlawful and so on and so forth. They are more sophisticated, they make more distinctions, they have more experience, and they are less detached from the center of the society. Military tend to be more extreme in the measures they take. They tend to be less sophisticated in making distinctions. So I think we should leave the military to prepare for war, and I think that we should make better use of the police. And I'll tell you later why I think that in general, the law enforcement perspective is a better one than the military one of fighting terrorism. And of course, there is covert action, special operations, very important. But I think that hard approaches should not be ruled out. They do constitute a component, and a good component, an important component, but not a decisive component in a more comprehensive policy, which by necessity must include some of the softer approaches as well. Let's evaluate some of these policies. Recent research indicates that along the scale of diplomacy, intelligence, preemption, deterrence, the last is the least effective. And I want to emphasize this because many of us instinctively would say that the thing to do is to deter them from ever trying to carry out their plans. And certainly my fellow Israelis like deterrence as a way of looking at security problems. But I don't think that it works particularly well in this particular case. I think that diplomacy and negotiations work in some cases better than the harder, particularly, but by no means only, when they involve domestic religious and communal leaders. Religion is here to stay, and matters of religions and faith play a huge role in terrorist ideology and motivation, and they must be taken for granted. They are here to stay, and we have to deal with them. The military don't know how to deal with them. We have to deal with them in different ways. Preemption is also very difficult and works only under very special circumstances, which, however, might be changing now, perhaps with the appearance of the IS phenomenon, the ISIS phenomenon, which has been on the decline as a foundation for a territorial state, but it's still very much alive and kicking as a foundation for terrorist activities around the world. Deterrence, which appears instinctively appealing, does not seem to work. It just doesn't work in most cases, according to recent findings. You will see this in the literature. One reason for this is that deterrence, as I said, cannot deter, cannot fight, cannot preempt, cannot obviate religious motivation. Because what are you going to do? Threaten a religious would-be terrorist who wants to blow himself up with death? He wants to die. He believes in the justification of death in his particular case. He even believed that it will be better for him in person if he goes to heaven after death, having died for a just cause. So the conventional ideas of deterrence, threatening people with punishment, penalties, imprisonment, and ultimately death, just don't deter. Intelligence seems to be working better. It is of critical importance, particularly for prevention, but not only. Good intelligence is a prerequisite for almost everything else that makes sense in the field of counter-EFT. But such intelligence is hard to come by because the organizations such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and so on are difficult to penetrate. Some of this has to do with cultural differences. And as I said, with the general difficulty of penetrating close ethnic and religious communities, many of which exist in major cities all across Europe. And you see them in places like Marseille in France, Göteborg in Sweden, some parts of Brussels, some cities in the UK, such as Brighton, and so on and so forth. And you see islands. You see a huge Turkish haven, for instance, in Berlin, Germany. And how are you going to penetrate this? Sometimes the cultural barriers are just daunting. Nevertheless, improving intelligence is perhaps the first challenge we have to tackle if we really want to be successful in this constant fight against terrorism. Reforming ways and means of collecting and analyzing good intelligence about EFT, therefore, is of the utmost importance. Many pundits, myself included, feel that it is the single most pressing task we must face at this point. This requires a massive investment in such fields as the study of languages, study of culture, study of religious traditions. In most countries, we don't have that. Enough knowledge of the relevant languages. We don't understand the religious traditions of the people around us. We don't really get a good sense of their way of life and how it differs from our own. And I think this is something that must change. And this is something where we, the academic community, can make a contribution. More study, more education, more depth, more dissemination of information, of insights, of understanding the other, for better or worse. This means patience. Building up good intelligence takes a lot of time, patience, and resources, human and material. You have to educate people, you have to teach people, you have to train people, you have to give them a chance to do their thing in the streets. And it's not going to bring you benefits in the immediate future. And therefore, some people say it's a waste, but it's not. Actually, it's the best investment you can make. The very best investment is to study, is to reach the depth of the problem, is to train people and to spread knowledge. There is nothing else that works as well in the long run and profoundly. Albert Einstein once said, this has been quoted innumerable times, that imagination is more important than knowledge. This aphorism is of special relevance, in my view, to EFT, because terrorists tend to be creative. You have to give them that. They have to be innovative. They tend to be imaginative. They always come up with new ideas, these new ways of hurting you, these new points which you can call the soft underbelly of our society. They are very quick to diagnose weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And once you adopt a certain set of countermeasures, terrorists diagnose this very quickly, the countermeasure, then they switch to new targets, to new weapons, new strategies, and even to new technologies. A slow, cumbersome governmental or security apparatus apparently will never be able to catch up with such a level of original thinking. And let us just for a moment think of the possibilities involving cyber terrorism, which is in its infancy, or the possibility of WMD in the hands of EFT organizations, not out of the question at the present time, with the various Iranian efforts we can see in the Middle East. You can see some minor examples of this already in the hands of the Houthis in the Yemen. In general, I think this field of cyber terrorism is a new field which should be cultivated at the universities even more than it has been recently. And we need to study it and understand it much more profoundly than we have so far. There is something in the literature I'm not sure about, and I want to share with you the insights I'm not completely in agreement with. Most of the research that I've seen indicates that so-called strong democracies react strongly, which is to say with plenty of power and force, to terrorist provocations and threats, whereas weaker democracies do less of this. I think that the definitions here are a problem for me. What is a strong democracy? There is the classic set of definitions by Butler and others, but well-established democracies which are bottom-up, which are profoundly participatory and all that. I don't really see how that leads to strong measures against terrorism. I think that we have to qualify this statement. I think that strong democracies, which are also strong states, for example, the United States, which, if it is still a strong democracy in the present crisis, tend to indeed react strongly, whereas weaker democracies often tend to be also weaker states. They have fewer resources to do more of the hard stuff. This is a field of research I don't really buy the arguments of, and we need to study this more profoundly before we make such very, very general sweeping statements. I do think that cooperation between democracies might overcome this gap. Democracies should agree a little bit more than they have so far about the right mixture of strong measures, or if you wish, hard measures and soft measures. And some of it is happening, but not enough. And I think that here, there's still the traditions of sovereignty and exigencies of practical politics prevent us from sufficient, despite the existence of the EU and other such impressive international organizations and forms of governance. The most important point I want to make is that we must remain democratic. The greatest danger of EFT is not that they will, God forbid, kill so many people or blow up so many buses and such. The greatest danger they pose to democracies is to provoke these democracies into taking steps and measures which are not democratic, and hence they undermine the ideological foundations of society. When this happens, the terrorists win, and we must not allow them to win. Let us remain faithful to our belief, to our ideology, to our foundations, to our form of government, and whatever we need to do to fight the security danger, let us do within the framework of what we are and what we believe and what we aspire to be. I think it is possible once in a while to make a certain compromise in order to counter EFT violence and take certain emergency measures. But the foundations of whatever policy is adopted must not be in contradiction to democratic, cultural, social, and legal norms. Survey research shows, some of it by myself, if I may say so, the societies that are fundamentally healthy. There is a definite consensus about democratic foundations of the ideology of the state and the society are able to counter EFT and to recover from traumatic events with relative ease. Whereas societies which suffer from major ills such as discrimination, deprivation, lack of cohesion, and excessive socioeconomic gaps suffer a great deal from EFT and find it difficult to restore their fundamental norms after acts of and incidents of EFT. So building resilience by social reform, when and where this is necessary, is an absolute prerequisite. In case you are running out of patience, I'm close to my conclusions. Some ideas about the future and for the future. I think that democratic societies should do more in coming up with creative ideas using technological means in countering EFT, as there are many relative advantages here. And they also spare the need to injure human dignity. In some major cases, say airport security, which seemed almost the weakest point in the daily life of democratic societies, this has been enormously successful, just using the right technological means. There is the cost of trying the patience of the traveling public. It's not much fun, but it solves the problem without excessively injuring the human dignity of the people involved, of the travelers. Research is now being conducted, and this is not science fiction, I can assure you, about the possible creative use of robots in counter-terrorism with some promise of great effectiveness in the foreseeable future, particularly utilizing artificial intelligence. Information technology. Research shows massive use of the web by EFT activists on all levels. Some friends of mine have done a great deal of study on the so-called lone wolf phenomenon. Okay, a terrorist who doesn't belong to an organization, but just hits the street one day and starts shooting or bombing or knifing people. As a matter of fact, the argument in recent research is that there is no such thing as a lone wolf. Every terrorist needs support, needs advice, needs counsel, needs cooperation, needs to share emotions, feelings, and identities. And therefore, if you use the internet and cell phone communication the right way, I think you can identify most patterns of recruitment and support, physical and moral, and often take preventive measures. Now, of course, there is a problem here with the right to privacy and so on. And this is a situation in which you have to come up with the right balance, not to injure the right to privacy and the democratic forms of open communications. At the same time, if you want to follow what the terrorists are planning, that's the best avenue you have. So I think it has been a tremendously effective tool already in the hands of security and governmental agencies, with all due respect to the violation of rights involved. How do we win? Now here I want to offer you a perspective. First, I don't think we can get rid of EFT forever. You cannot win the war on terrorism once and for all to say we have gotten rid of the problem. There is no vaccine to inoculate society against it. It is best to acknowledge that it's here to stay, and eliminating it altogether is not possible without compromising our democratic values and standards. it would make sense, in my view, to compare EFT's violent manifestations with other menacing social phenomena, particularly to one, crime, and second, traffic accidents. They claim victims and they kill people, and they are here to stay, and we can live with them if we reduce them to a magnitude and level of tolerable menace rather than lethal threat to ourselves. I think that these are bad things to live with, organized crime or other crime and traffic accidents, and we should keep fighting them with all the means we have within our democratic society. But they know, and we know, that they will not go away. We can only reduce them to a level of tolerable nuisance, unpleasantness, and manageable daily risk, which does not disrupt the normal routine of our democratic way of life. Finally, 2 or 3 minutes of comments on the specifics of the Israeli case. So far, I've been speaking about democracies in general, particularly having in mind the Western European democracies, but I would like to make a series of comments, 6, 7 comments on the particulars of the Israeli case. First of all, Israel faces massive state-sponsored terrorism emanating at the moment from Iran and also from quasi-states such as Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, on a scale which is not seen at the moment by any other country. Secondly, Israel controls a fairly large hostile population in what the world calls the West Bank, the Israelis call Judea and Samaria, something which doesn't exist in other countries yet. However, there is some resemblance in the hugely, I think, segregationist trends that you see in certain large European cities. Israel has had the initial set of lone wolf attacks and has them on a larger scale than other countries. And not finally, in the middle of this, something very painful, the dilemma of targeted killings. The Israeli example shows that there are 2 ways, if any, to try and reduce the level of involvement of organized terrorism in daily crime. One is the targeted killings, meaning threatening and at times, unfortunately, carrying out the threat against the leaders of terrorist organizations. And secondly, what I call follow the money, trying to dry up the financial channels because terrorists need money, organizations. Follow the money is okay. You can do it democratically and I think in a very sophisticated way. Targeted killings, multiple dilemmas of justice and legal procedures and arbitrariness and secrecy and so on and so forth. So I think that the less of this we do, all of us, Israel and others, the United States also engages in targeted killings, for example. The less that we do of this, the better. But in certain extreme cases, there may not be a choice. And from then on, the threat that this might threaten the lives of the people who are leaders and send others to die might be one way of deterrence, which may not be 100% effective, but contribute something to preventing terrorism. Israel is particularly, I think, vulnerable to terrorism because the Israeli public is more sensitive than perhaps any other to casualties and hijackings as a result of Jewish history. And so Israel often treats 1,000 captured terrorists for a single Israeli soldier abducted, quite in, I think, in contradiction to American policy. And finally, Israelis have learned, I think Israelis are an example of what I'm trying to preach. We in Israel have learned to live with a level of menace and discomfort. We recognize that these will never go away, and we have to go on living our lives, and we have to go on living our lives in a democratic way, in a democratic society, faithful to what we are and what we would like to be. Thank you very much for your patience. I've taken up 35 minutes. I hope it's not too long.
Thank you very much, Professor Ben Dor, for this lecture. I remind you that if you have any questions, please write them in the chat, and we will have the opportunity to introduce them to all of the speakers today. The next speaker is Professor Christian Kaunert. Professor Christian Kaunert is the director of the International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales and a Jean Monnet Chair in EU Counter-Terrorism. Previously, Professor Kaunert served as an academic director and professor at the Institute for European Studies, the Free University of Brussels, and as a professor of international politics at the University of Dundee. His has a clear focus on policing and international security, especially in the area of the EU counter-terrorism, including its external dimension, terrorism and counter-terrorism, and international relations. Professor Christian Kaunert has published 18 books and over 100 articles in scholarly journals on security studies, international relations, counterterrorism, and European politics. The last book, Refugee Security and the EU, written together with our third speaker, which I will present later, Professor Sarah Leonard, analyzes the extent and the modalities of the securitization of asylum seekers and refugees in the EU. Christian, please.
Right, well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. But before I start, let me thank Gabby for being with us. It was a great honor to have you. I hope that at some point we will actually be able to do the workshop in person. And of course, the vaccine gives us a lot of hope that this will come sooner than later. Thank you to, it's a great honor for me to come after Gabby, because your talk was absolutely outstanding. I think it was a really great extrapolation of all the kind of essential works of terrorism and in relation to democracies, and of course presenting the case of Israel. So what I'm trying to do in my presentation will be a little bit smaller in that I want to give a little bit the outline of how EU counterterrorism came to be, how the European Union in effect started developing policies on counterterrorism, and looking a little bit as to where this might go in the future. So I think, as Gabby pointed out before, terrorism has been widely used. The media is using the word terrorism all the time. I think it's right to point out that while it's widely used, it's not always very well understood. And I think that's the need for academics to really bring a little focus to that topic. It's also become part of a certain media hype, of course, especially after 9/11. And in fact, the media hype is what is the oxygen for the terrorism, for the terrorists in itself. And then we had various terror attacks in Madrid and London, later in Paris and Brussels. And I mean, there's so many that I could mention right now that we've had over the last couple of years that it would go on for quite a while. So a number of people have been wondering whether this is in fact the greatest security threat of our time. Now with the pandemic, other people have been arguing this is also quite important. Of course, I think it's very important to point out that the policy response, both in the United States and Europe, has become much, much more significant since 9/11. Certainly, when it comes to Europe, we can say that there's the birth of a new policy area, as it were. Now, the historical aspect to this is that, of course, in Europe more than in America, there's a certain history to terrorism. In Britain, in particular, we've had a lot of experience with IRA terrorism in Northern Ireland, but other European countries had various experiences of terrorism. For instance, Spain had significant experience of ethno-nationalist terrorism, in particular with ETA. We had radical left-wing terrorist groups. We had the Brigate Rosse in Italy. We had the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany. So to an extent, we've had a certain common European experience of various forms of terrorism. In fact, well before 9/11, it was mainly in the 1970s, 1980s, partially 1960s. So we've had that type of experience, but we've also had in Europe experience of non-European terrorism on European soil. For instance, we've had the PKK, the Turkish terrorist organization, in operating on European soil. We've also had the PLO, and there have been a number of different very high-profile attacks also on European soil. So over time, what we can say is that we've seen a certain Europeanization of the policy issue, where Europe over time starts to get more involved, first as part of an intergovernmental cooperation, particularly in the 1970s and in the 1980s. We've had an intergovernmental cooperation, the so-called Trevi Group, later then after 1992 as part of the European Union. But before I go into that, let me start with the beginnings of that intergovernmental type of cooperation, which is, of course, the Council for Europe, the Council of Europe, sorry. The Council of Europe is not legally part of the European Union at all. It is, in fact, an organization that was established in terms of voluntary cooperation. It was an organization established in 1949 in Strasbourg, which was meant for voluntary cooperation with no supranational characteristics. So unlike the European Union, it had, legally speaking, relatively weak instruments. It still has. It has instruments such as recommendations, resolutions, opinions, nothing of a legally binding sort, unlike the European Union later. But it provided a framework, a first framework for European countries where they could address some of those issues as political issues and come together. And as part of this Council of Europe, we had a number of different instruments that were developed. And I think it's important to point out what was developed, because I want to tell you a little bit, or prepare the ground also then for Sarah's presentation later about Brexit and counterterrorism cooperation. Because here we have the importance of a number of different instruments that are important even for the EU today, because the EU today defines the Council of Europe instruments as part of the so-called legal acquis of the European Union, as part of what new member states have to adopt, whether they want to or not, in order to join the European Union, even though they're not EU instruments as such. So, for instance, we had a Convention of Extradition in 1957, another one in 75, and another one in 78. We had a Mutual Legal Assistance Agreement in Criminal Matters of 59, and then later in 78. Convention on International Validity of Criminal Judgments of 1970, and also the European Convention on the Suppression of Terrorism in 1977. So these conventions then provide the starting point for the European Union, the departure for EU action in this particular field. Interior ministers start to meet, they start to develop personal relations, traditionally more inward-looking ministries. Of course, the police, as you know, is mainly responsible for domestic affairs, and developing a certain corps d'esprit, European mentality, in order to increase efficiency that perhaps wasn't quite there in this intergovernmental framework. So to an extent, I just give you one example to underline the point that I'm trying to make. We had the European Extradition Convention of 1957 that in the United Kingdom was only ratified in 1991, which meant that from 1957 until 1991, this legal instrument that existed was legally not worth very much, because you couldn't actually extradite.
Christian, your microphone is off.
I can't hear you either.
Sorry, has that been for long?
No,
No,
1 minute.
for 10 seconds.
Okay, all right. So I suggested there's a certain European mentality that was created, and a certain negative experience that intergovernmentalism as part of these conventions doesn't work. The UK, as I pointed out, the UK ratified a convention on extradition, a European Convention on Extradition, that was signed in 1957, only in 1991. And as a result of that, was unable to extradite a single terrorist, of course, until the 1990s, which was the moment when the Soviet Union was already disappearing. So this, for many, many years, unable to use this legal instrument to extradite terrorists. So this, when the terrorist threat was primarily domestic, perhaps wasn't so much of a significant issue. But of course, as Gabi pointed out, terrorism has become increasingly transnational, especially when we talk about Al-Qaeda, when we talk about Daesh, ISIS, and we're seeing an increasingly transnationalized phenomenon, and there it starts becoming a problem when you cannot extradite people, when people flee a particular jurisdiction, go to another jurisdiction, and there's no good legal instruments to bring those people back. Now, in the 1970s, we see that European interior minister starts to meet regularly, the so-called Trevi Group, an informal meeting of interior ministers starts meeting, at the time without legal competence. It's just informal political discussion, but it becomes part of what then later becomes the European Political Cooperation, that also then later becomes part of European foreign policy. They coordinate their action in the fight against European terrorism at the time, primarily domestic terrorism, but over time they increased their agenda to take into account crime, drugs, migration, asylum seekers, a whole range of issues that enter the agenda. Now, the 1980s then see the so-called Schengen Agreement, where a number of countries come together, France, Germany, and the Benelux countries, to abolish internal border controls, to provide for freedom of movement for people. But as Gabi pointed out, freedom of movement for people can also be a freedom of movement for criminals and terrorists, which then means that if you're going to allow for that, you also need to develop other instruments to kind of make sure that that in fact this risk is much reduced. We then see other types of conventions later, the Schengen Implementation Convention, and so on. Schengen system ultimately starts to be operational in 1995. The first time that the legal competences enter the level of the European Union is in fact in the 1990s. In 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty, when the European Union gains legal competences on counterterrorism matters. Member states at the time were a bit dissatisfied with their intergovernmental experience. The United Kingdom starts to receive an opt-out, opt-in clause. Denmark opts out of that. The treaty then provides for the basis for EU legislation. I should point out the UK, even though it was able to opt out of all of these developments, actually was very much at the forefront of developing a lot of these instruments, and in fact opted into every single instrument that the European Union developed until Brexit. And we then have a number of different legal instruments provided by the Maastricht Treaty, but overall they're not very strong legal instruments, very similar to international legal instruments. So the 1997 Amsterdam Treaty provided for much stronger competences on these kind of matters, also integrated Schengen into the European Union, and in fact provided for the legal competences that were then used after 9/11. What I should also point out is, of course, bilateral efforts in Europe. One of them that I wanted to point out is, of course, the Spanish and the French case, because, of course, it's one of the very symbolic cases where, you know, when ETA terrorists were fighting General Franco and the far-right government of Spain at the time, they were receiving, in fact, safe haven in France. And as a result of that, France was usually not recognizing them as terrorists, but was perceiving them as freedom fighters. When the regime then changed in Spain, we see a difference there in terms of attitude. In 1997, for instance, France abolishes the possibility for refugee status for Spanish citizens on political grounds as Spain starts to transition towards democracy. French border country that used to be used as sanctuary ground and launching points for ETA is secured much more prominently, and the French turn against terrorism as it starts spilling into their territory. We see a number of different events here, strengthening of border controls with Spain, starting to extradite ETA activists back to Spain. We see in an early 90s very number of high-profile arrests where 40 ETA members are arrested in France. We see the rest of the ETA's Barcelona cell, and also the capture of the deputy head of ETA and the discovery of a bomb factory. Generally, the main issue in terms of bilateral affairs between European countries tends to be extradition. And that's why, in fact, European Union instruments on extradition are so important, because extradition usually was a problem in the sense that it was refused either on political grounds, because countries were suggesting that those are not really terrorists, they're freedom fighters, in fact, or on judicial grounds that countries were saying, yes, okay, maybe that is a terrorist, but we don't trust your judicial system. It's not quite at the level of our judicial system, which is obviously superior to yours. And that is very often another problem with extradition. So we also see other issues like granting of visa to potential terrorists that some countries are doing, and of course policing and intelligence cooperation, which at the time is at a relatively low level of cooperation. So at the time, we then see an increase in multilateral cooperation. In particular, after 9/11, we see a very significant jump forward. The EU action plan here foresees cooperation on policing and judicial cooperation. It foresees improving airport security. There's a very strong effort that was made in airport security, cooperation on the suppression of terrorist financing. Here the EU has really been pushing a lot of countries also outside the European Union to adopt a number of UN Security Council resolutions. We see the sharing of expertise in emergency planning, diplomatic initiatives also with various Middle Eastern countries, and also humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. But the two main instruments that were really adopted after 9/11 was, firstly, for the first time, the EU agrees what a definition of terrorism is, because one thing is important to point out. There's somebody that is with his camera on there. Sorry, would you mind closing the camera? Okay. There is the definition of terrorism is particularly important because, of course, there's no, in a sense, internationally legally agreed definition of terrorism. We see that, for instance, the FBI has a definition, CIA has a definition, MI5 have a definition, a number of different actors and agencies have a definition, but there's no internationally legally agreed definition. And that's why it was so important when, after 9/11, the EU actually managed to agree on a legal definition. We can quibble about the details of that definition, but it was for the first time that the EU was able to take really serious action when, before 9/11, I think it was 5 out of the current 27 EU countries even had a definition of terrorism. We now see an adoption of a legal definition of terrorism across all EU countries, including later also the new member states. The second important one is the European arrest warrant, because the European arrest warrant basically transforms the very essence of European counterterrorism cooperation in the EU, because extradition was traditionally one of those very, very difficult subjects that have never really worked very well before 9/11. What the European arrest warrant does is that it abolishes the term even extradition in the EU, and it becomes something more like surrender, a little bit model according to the American model between different states, but even to an extent going further than American states. What used to be a diplomatic procedure between different EU member states becomes now an administrative procedure between different judiciaries. So they're no longer talking to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then that becomes a diplomatic procedure with the other Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the other country. They're talking directly. So basically, Judge A demands the surrender of a particular terrorist suspect from Judge B, who is in that other country, who then instructs the police to arrest or to surrender that particular suspect. There's no more diplomatic involvement in there at all. So there's no more diplomatic or political refusal of extraditions, like I was giving the example before between France and Spain, where France was seeing them as freedom fighters. So that is cut out. So there's no more political assessment as such, but it is falling under legal definition of what exactly terrorism is. And it also abolishes the next thing that is an inherent system of international law, what is the so-called dual criminality principle. Dual criminality principle with international legal instruments is basically that in order to extradite somebody, the crime has to be a crime in the jurisdiction where the crime was committed, and it has to be a crime in the jurisdiction where the person has fled to. So in both countries, it has to be a crime. The European arrest warrant abolishes that, so now it only needs to be a crime in the jurisdiction where the crime was committed, no longer in the country where the person has fled to. So that means that, for instance, the failed bombers that, as you may remember, in London in 2005, we had first the actual attack that worked, but 2 weeks later we had a failed bombing in London, and in fact the suspects then fled London and then found their way to Italy. Now, traditionally, what would have happened in this particular case is that the person would have probably never been extradited back, possibly, but certainly even if that person had been extradited back, the whole thing would have taken first a legal route in Italy, which could have taken anything up to 15 years until a criminal suspect is actually convicted in Italy. But then the diplomatic service might have said, no, we don't really agree with that. Person might not have been extradited back. This is particularly true if we talk about other countries than Italy, where it might have even been worse. Now, this particular person was extradited back to London in a matter of weeks, and not a matter of months, not a matter of years, but in a matter of weeks was extradited back. So just to see to show the effectiveness of that particular instrument. We also had then the development of different agencies. Here I just want to point out two, and there's a variety of different other ones. That is Europol, the European Policing Agency, that was created by a European Convention and entered into force on the 1st of October 1998, with protocols in force and operational on the 1st of January 1999. It provided then the legal basis of powers by the Treaty of Amsterdam of 1997, with not many concrete legislative measures at the beginning, but certainly with limited operational powers. Idea here is enhancing cooperation between member states authorities, initially not foreseen to be dealing with terrorism, but later pushed on the agenda, in particular Spain pushed to have Europol with a stronger role in counterterrorism. And obviously also then after 9/11, a lot of compromises are then found with the French and with other countries that were maybe more reluctant to give Europol that particular role. There's also the possibility of joint investigation teams with Europol, with competent national authorities that help national investigations then, and also facilitating the exchange of information between the different national authorities. We also then have another agency called Eurojust, which is kind of the counterpart to Europol, with a particular vision that is to become a European public prosecutor under the Lisbon Treaty. And in fact, it has become operational to an extent, not for terrorist offenses yet, because so far the European public prosecutor is only allowed to investigate against criminal activities against the budget of the European Union, so any type of corruption or that type of thing, the European public prosecutor can investigate, but with the possibility, according to the treaties, of extending the competence. So eventually we could foresee the possibility of a European public prosecutor also investigating terrorist offenses. Now, we see a number of these things, and I want to end in a moment also to give Sarah the opportunity to discuss Brexit. The horizon of these activities are what a number of European politicians have talked about in terms of the security union in the European Union. That Federica Mogherini, for instance, she said we need to be more joined up across internal and external policies, that those two things need to be more linked and also need to then feed into security and development policies. We also need to work harder in terms of the policy sectors, institutions, and the various member states. So I will end on this note and I will hand over to Sarah. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll be very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. Our last but not least, Professor Sarah Leonard. Sarah Leonard is a professor of international security at the University of the West of England. Professor Leonard was a lecturer in international security at the University of Salford, a Marie Curie Research Fellow at Sciences Po Paris, a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Dundee, and an associate professor in international affairs at Veslius, I hope I pronounced it correctly, College, the Free University of Brussels. Professor Leonard's research interests lie at the intersection between security studies and European studies. She is particularly interested in the study of securitization process and the development of the European Union's internal security policies, especially those relating to asylum, migration and borders, as well as counterterrorism. Professor Sarah Leonard has published 9 books and dozens of articles in scholarly journals on security studies, international relations, counterterrorism, and European politics. Sarah, please.
Thank you very much, Ori. Thank you to Mike and also to Gabby for joining us, and to Christian, of course. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. And a special thanks to Joanna, who is working behind the scenes, but you know, the logistical aspects are really important. The devil is in the details. So thank you so much, Joanna, for dealing with the logistical aspects of this talk today. And of course, thank you so much to all of you for coming, listen to us and ask questions in the chat box. So as Ori mentioned, my background is in security studies and also in EU studies like Christian, but we do appreciate that a few of you may not be so interested in all the intricacies of the European Union. So I'll try to keep that as clear as possible. But this is quite a complicated subject. I think Brexit has turned out to be a very complicated subject, and international security cooperation in the EU, and so including counterterrorism, is a very complicated subject, as you have understood from Christian's presentation. So all these complications put together make it quite challenging to kind of summarize where we are at the moment in terms of the possible impact of Brexit on counterterrorism cooperation in the EU, and also the impact on the UK. I think, first of all, it's important to say that there will be a significant impact, whatever agreements we are getting in the end. So when we set the date for the talk today, I really thought that by now we would actually know what's going to happen on the 1st of January. So I thought we would have a clearer idea of the relationship between the UK and the EU after the current transition period ends. Or either we would know what agreement has been concluded, or we would know that for sure there has been a decision for the moment not to have an agreement. And instead we are told that negotiations are ongoing, that, you know, we are in a tunnel or whatever it is. There seems to be some light. So let's hope that we hear at some point what's going to happen. So all I can do then today, because I can't discuss actually how counter-terrorism cooperation between the UK and the EU is going to happen after the 1st of January, is to tell you a little bit more about the negotiations, what the two parties are trying to achieve, and also a bit more on the impact that leaving the EU is going to have for UK counter-terrorism. And from Christian's discussion earlier, I think he has very well shown how much counterterrorism cooperation in the EU has grown, and how important some of the instruments that have been developed in the last 3 years are. So one thing that is sure is that should the UK lose access to these instruments, it's going to have a significant impact on counterterrorism, and not a very positive one. So I think that if you speak to professionals of counterterrorism, if you speak to people working in the police forces, in the National Crime Agency, it's quite rare to find people who have a lot of positive things to say about the impact that Brexit is going to have. And I think that is just looking at the practicalities and, you know, all the advantages that the instruments developed by the EU have had. And so what you stand to lose once you are no longer part of all these arrangements. So notably in this presentation, I'm drawing on research that we have been conducted with Christian, who spoke earlier, but also with a colleague, Dr. Mackenzie at the University of Liverpool. And we have an article coming out in a couple of weeks, actually, in the European Foreign Affairs Review, which is entitled "They Need Us More Than We Need Them." And basically, it's understanding the position of the UK in the current negotiations with the EU on the future of counterterrorism cooperation, and also actually understanding why the UK has been taking the position that it has. So if we want to summarize the position taken by the UK in the negotiations, it is pretty much to say to the EU, well, we have played an important role in the development of counterterrorism cooperation so far. We have a lot to bring. We have a lot of experience. We contribute a lot of data and a lot of information currently. So we all stand to benefit by coming to an agreement, and some kind of pragmatic agreement. And it's also in your interest to accommodate our demands. And actually, if you look back at how the UK has behaved as an EU member state, and in particularly in that area, you actually understand why the UK would have this expectation. Because if you look back, I mean, and I'm not going to do it now because we would be here for a long time, but basically what the UK has managed to do over the years is to negotiate for itself a very specific position within the European Union. So as you know, it had an exceptional position when it was a member of the Union, not being a member of the Schengen area, not being a member of the Euro, and also in terms of internal security cooperation, which is the area under which counterterrorism falls, having again a very specific position with a very complicated system of opt-ins and opt-outs, so being a part of certain aspects of the cooperation and the legislation, but not of others. And in a sense, we can see that this was enabled by the other EU member states that were quite happy to accommodate the UK over time. And what we see now in the negotiations is that the EU has shown itself to be less accommodating than before, and has made it very clear to the UK government that actually a state that is outside the EU, so that is called a third state, for the purpose of the EU. So the EU, as you probably know, divides the world into the EU member states and the EU third states. So the UK is now a third state, and it should not have advantages and access to tools in a way that is more beneficial than it would have been when they were still in the EU. So they have made it very clear that they won't give that kind of very special treatment to the UK. So at the moment, all I can tell you is what both parties seem to want to achieve. When it comes to the UK, well, the UK has been making a point that it wants to keep access to several of the instruments that Christian has mentioned earlier. So particularly important instrument in the EU counter-terrorism policy is the Schengen information system, so kind of huge database containing a lot of important information, and that's of relevance to criminals, foreign terrorist fighters, stolen vehicles, arms, dangerous objects, so it contains a lot of really important data. The European Criminal Records Information System, which is about ensuring exchange of information on convictions, criminal convictions in other member states. Then there is the so-called PRIM system, which is about sharing data concerning DNA profiles, vehicle registration data, and fingerprints. And then there's also the PNR data, so the passenger name record, which is about the exchange of information for individuals traveling, notably by plane, but that could be also by boat, for example, amongst member states. So we have all these tools that the UK had access to when it was a member of the EU, although it only had access to some aspects of the Schengen information system. Another question is, to what extent can it negotiate access to all these tools, being actually outside the EU? And so that's the whole question. And there has been a lot of lobbying from, notably from the National Police Chiefs Council, from the National Crime Agency. So they have written letters to the government or to the also to the Home Affairs Committee in Parliament to highlight the kind of problems that would come with no longer having access to these various instruments. Another important issue is the issue of the European arrest warrant. So Christian already mentioned how much of a game changer it has been in terms of counterterrorism. And so he mentioned the example of this so-called failed bomber. So one of the 4 people involved in the failed attacks on the 21st of June 2005. So Hussein Osman had managed to flee from the scene. So this, if you don't really remember the details, so there were 4 people involved that had targeted 3 trains in the underground and 1 bus. Then the devices actually did not explode, and they fled. And Hussein Osman had fled actually on a Eurostar train going to France, and from there going to Italy. So thanks to a European arrest warrant, he was swiftly arrested. So within 8 days, he was arrested in Rome. And then within 56 days, he was returned to the UK. So this was substantially faster than what would have happened under previous arrangements based on the European Convention on Extradition from the Council of Europe from 1957. And to give you another example of how actually things don't work very well, when before we had the European arrest warrant, we can take another example again of somebody wanted for a terrorist for his involvement in terrorism activities. So that's the example of Rashid Hamda. And he was wanted by the French authorities in connection with a series of terrorist bombings in France in 1995. And so the French government had to make 3 requests for its extradition. And in the end, there were 9 separate legal proceedings to extradite him. And in the end, it took 10 years before he was extradited from the UK to France. So 10 years, from 1995 until 2005. And you can compare that to the 2 months it took to extradite Hussein Osman. So this is one of the reasons for which there is concern in the counterterrorism community when it comes to Brexit, and notably the impact that it will have if the UK is no longer part of this system based on the European arrest warrant. So when it comes to the various instruments I've mentioned before, there are actually fallback options in a lot of cases. For example, when it comes to PRUM, there isn't really a fallback options, but for other aspects like mutual corporations, so they, there are other areas, other old conventions from the Council of Europe on which you can fall back. But the problem there, and it's actually at the heart of why all the EU created all these new instruments, is that these older instruments have a lot of limitations. So, for example, there is no time scale, no obligation of a response, or there's no time scale, meaning that 10 years later you may still be waiting for the information or for the person you want to have extradited. So, this is precisely the reason for which the EU adopted these instruments. It was that the previous instruments had a lot of limitations and were really not working well in practice. And certainly having very slow arrangements in an area that depends so much on having a fast response is highly problematic. So certainly this means that if the UK is not able to replicate the kind of arrangements that it had, there will be a very significant a loss in terms of actually how fast the response can be. Of course, there can be new systems created, there can be new arrangements put into place. And once the UK is no longer part of the EU, it can still work with other member states of the EU and other states in the world, notably through Interpol. But as you know, there are a lot of limitations there because it's far less automated, it's far less, it's far slower than the arrangements within the EU. So just to mention that, for example, when it comes to the Schengen information system, there is work being done, notably by officials from the Home Office. So they are looking into developing what they call an alternative alert sharing platform that may be capable of replicating some of the functionality of the Schengen information system. So the idea there seems to be, we don't have much information about this platform called iLeap yet, but it seems that the idea is to kind of build a new Schengen information system in which EU member states could also get involved. Of course, you have to wonder from the point of view of these other EU member states whether it would be attractive for them to become involved in a new platform, in new arrangements, when they have their own platforms, their own arrangements, which they find work pretty well amongst themselves. So, of course, from the point of view of EU member states, it's a kind of duplication of work. Like the beauty, if you like, of the arrangements that were in place when the UK was part of the EU was that information could be shared to the various partners in one go. And now, in a sense, what the UK government is trying to say is to say, well, you can have your own system, but then maybe you can also share with us. And obviously that really complicates matters, and that may not be something that the EU member states are very keen to do. So where are we now? Well, we are on the 25th of November. And I think, like in other areas, it's really unclear what's going to happen on the 1st of January. And whatever happens, there will need to be some period of transition also for all the people concerned here, in this case in counterterrorism, to learn new tools, new ways of working. So we have to see what kind of arrangements are going to be agreed upon. But then, there may be a need for some kind of transition, and if there is no official transition, there will be, in practice, some transition, whilst all the actors in this area, in this case in counterterrorism, learn new tools and new arrangements and new ways of doing things. So perhaps we need another seminar in a couple of weeks' time or a couple of months' time to see how things are panning out in practice. So I think I will leave it at that, and I look forward to any questions you may have for me. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Before the question phase, I'm honored to introduce Mike Edwards, who is a senior lecturer at the International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. In a public service career spanning 20 years, Mike has extensive experience of working within military, policing, and security roles at local, regional, national, and international levels. Mike, your comments and insight, please, for this session.
Okay, thank you, Ori, and thank you to the guests so far, Professor Ben Dor, Professor Kaunert, and Professor Leonard as well. It's been really, really interesting listening to you, and I'm just noting some of the comments and some of the questions that are coming through at the moment. Absolutely fantastic. There's a lot of interesting comments and questions coming through so far. So my first question, I suppose, from an Israeli perspective and from a UK perspective. As Ori's already mentioned, I've previously worked within counterterrorism, and I would be really interested to know from Professor Ben Dor, from a social perspective then, what could the UK learn from the Israeli tactics and vice versa? So to you, Professor Ben Dor, what would, from a social perspective, what could the UK learn from Israeli tactics, and what could Israel learn from the UK tactics and strategies?
Okay, are we answering the questions right now, one by one?
Please.
Okay. I'm not sure what we can learn from the UK, and maybe you can tell us what kind of paradigm has come out of the UK experience. I do know that we closely follow what you do. We have had a long relationship with the UK authorities on this. And we see the uniqueness of UK police and policing, which is something we can learn from. And your experience with the massive terrorism of the IRA during the worst period is something that we followed very, very closely. The IRA, by the way, cooperated with many terrorist organizations. We try to read this. There is that. From the Israeli social perspective, which you are asking, is you need a level of okay, let me just give you an example of what I have in mind. We have a pandemic, okay? During the pandemic, people are claustrophobic and they are just dying to get out and do something to revive themselves, to infuse some dynamism into their lives. So during the period in the summer when there was no lockdown, there was a long period when things were going well in Israel. Many Palestinians from the West Bank just crossed the green line, so-called, and drove to the Mediterranean to enjoy the beaches. And there was a lot of criticism in Israel about this, saying, well, these are all potential terrorists. I mean, how do you police them? How do you oversee them? How do you make sure they go back? And the people in charge, the police people, not the military people, said it's a reasonable risk to take. The frustration that builds up in that society when they're unable to get out, they are hemmed in. They are hopeless in terms of having a piece of entertainment, making their lives more tolerable. It's more dangerous in driving them to terrorism than letting them go to the beach, even if there are a couple of incidents along the way. At the same time, it is obvious that you have to watch the routes very carefully, that you have to see at the end of the day who is on the beach and who went back. So effective policing here is very important, but tolerance towards another society and allowing the people to live a level of life which reduces the level of frustration is very, very important. This is, I think, one of the secrets that we have lived with the menace of terrorism as reasonably well as we have. The second thing is, one thing I also emphasized in my talk, this is the matter of intelligence. The Israelis, like myself, are great believers in intelligence. in learning about the other, in penetrating, I don't mean penetrating physically, penetrating mentally the minds of the others to understand what makes them run, how they behave, how they are different. And I think that's a huge daunting challenge, I think, for the UK and then for the rest of Western Europe, with the huge migration you have had from countries like Afghanistan, like Pakistan, like Syria, and others. You have to learn more about these people, and you have to somehow visualize how they think and how they behave and how they act. And I think that we have done reasonably well in that respect, although not as well as I would like.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor Ben Dor. And just building on from that, learning from, just if I could stay with yourself for a second, just building on from the learning of...
what you hear from my part is just thunder and lightning, as somebody perhaps notes that you have to have British weather when you are participating in a UK conference. So
it's actually quite sunny. It's quite sunny here.
Oh, really? So,
yeah.
So you have exported your weather to our part of the world.
The other thing that we've learned. Okay. So, you know, just going on from what you were saying about learning and learning about, I suppose, the people that we're dealing with, you know, from a terrorism perspective, from an extremism perspective. I liked the thought that you come out with earlier on around policing being the primary role to manage communities and to influence communities in that way, and to be part of dealing with the issues that then we both face, and that's something that we do as well in the UK. But something else that you brought up as well was the intelligence and use of language, cultures, and religion. And it's something that I've been looking into fairly recently, certainly over the past 2 or 3 years now, is also linguistics. So not just from a language level, as in the way that we speak, but also linguistic analysis around imagery, around video, around both from a macro level and a micro level as well, and how those impact on communities, certainly with the use of social media. So, you know, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? And do we need to progress in that area as well around our intelligence work?
I couldn't agree more. I think that social linguistics, which is, I think, what you're referring to, is a tremendous tool. What do people mean when they say the words that we take for granted? Democracy, freedom, justice, equality, frustration, resistance. What do they mean to these people? A student of mine has just completed an MA thesis studying the word resistance in different cultures in the Middle East and what they mean. And I think that brings us much closer to understanding the type of phenomenon we are dealing with than anything else we could have done. So yes, social linguistics is one of the things we should cultivate and study and encourage our students to take on in order to further our not just information, but insight into the minds of the people we are dealing with.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor Ben Dor. Just one question for the panel, one question for the panel as a whole then, before we move on to some student questions or some guest questions. It was reported this week in the Times of Israel that there may be some moves between Israel and the US on planning to attack or potentially attack Iran, whether that be, you know, in the dying days of Trump's administration, whether that be nuclear facilities or not. What are your thoughts on that as a panel, and what do you think the impact of that could be if it comes off? Professor Ben Dor, if I stick with you on screen at the moment, please.
I think it's a bad idea. And I don't think any of it is going to happen. This is a game of threats. I think what is going to happen is something entirely different. There's going to be some sort of an effort to revive the JCPOA, the famous nuclear agreement with Iran, under much better conditions for us, the West, meaning better inspection and more commitments by the Iranians, including different kinds of technologies which are now excluded. So, and I think that these are now threats forcing more or less Iran to think along these lines. I do know as a fact, and you can quote me on that, that the Israeli security elite is entirely against this idea. Dangerous. Asking what the implications of that might be. An attack like that might just ignite the Middle East at the moment to an all-out warfare, which I don't think is anybody's interest at the moment. So I think that This is one of those, should we call them fake news? Mr. Trump likes to quote in his own favor. And this time the shoe is on the other foot. I think he and his people, his entourage, are spreading this idea for political purposes. There is nothing to it. I can tell you that this idea in Israel is just out of the question at the moment, and rightly so.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor Ben Dor. And the same question for Professor Kaunert, please. What are your thoughts on that? And do you have anything to add to Professor Ben Dor's comments?
Right, I don't think anybody could have answered that question better than what Gabi has just said. I think I agree in absolutely every part of what he just said, that I think it's a bad idea if it did happen, but I also don't think it's likely to happen because, well, basically the specter of the Biden presidency is already there. So I think all the relevant actors are getting ready for that. I think that will also mean kind of maybe pushing Biden in a kind of stronger kind of direction towards Iran. I think that is definitely something that will happen. I don't think that is trying to push Biden into a possible war with Iran. I think that would be a disastrous thing that nobody wants, and I don't think serious people in Washington advising that either. So I think that there's a general agreement that this would be a very, very bad idea. So I can't see anything like that happen. I do believe, though, that there's a kind of realignment coming in the Middle East, that powers are getting ready for Biden presidency, that they want Biden to take a stronger stance against Iran, that they want to renegotiate, but in a kind of a stronger way, perhaps, than what Obama was doing. I think that's.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kaunert. And Ori, that's everything from me, please. Back to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I see that we have a very interesting question here for all of you, but I will start from my question to Professor Ben Dor, please. Don't you think that, some argue that the Israeli security orientation assists them to deal more in a better way against terrorist threats in comparison to, let's say, the EU, UK, United States? Maybe you can add something about this topic and maybe show and express what is, let's say, unique in Israel in comparison to other states in regarding the fight against terrorism.
Well, I've tried to do that, apparently not very successfully. 2 or 3 things stand out. One is the sensitivity to certain aspects of terrorism in Israel, which doesn't exist in other countries. For example, in the United States, a soldier gets abducted and they look for him, and if they can't find him, they keep looking, and if they can't find him, then they wait until the opportunity presents itself to liberate him one way or another. In Israel, we don't have that kind of a patience, and we rush to make trades with terrorists and so on and so forth. That doesn't exist in other major democracies. Secondly, I think that we have a level of tolerance for terrorism as a daily menace that other people don't. I mean, we just listen. If there are no particular casualties or nobody is abducted, terrorists blew up something or other, we look upon it as just a fact of life which you have to live with, and just go on with our lives and conduct them according to our values and remain faithful to what we wanted to do. We are able to get the public to understand that if we do what the terrorists want us to do, what the terrorists provoke us to do, then we lose. And so the Israeli public has learned this. The third thing is, I think that the policing paradigm, which we spoke about and Mike spoke about quite rightly, I think that try to keep the military out of this. This is a law enforcement problem, like fighting crime, and the police are better equipped to deal with this than the military. And fourth, the public participates. The public shows a level of patience in Israel. When you go into a shopping center or any place, there's a strict regime of supervision. It exists also in the UK and other European countries, but in Israel it's stricter, and people are patient. They know that it is for their own good. So you have to educate the public itself to go along with it. And finally, as I said, the learning process and intelligence process in Israel are cultivated more than in other countries. So I think there is more reward in Israel when you want to study Arabic or you want to study Islam and so on and so forth than in other countries, because we know that this knowledge is absolutely essential in countering terrorism. But I don't like to, I wouldn't like to take too much credit. We are not all that successful. We take our licks, we lose quite a few battles, and sometimes we overreact. So not everything is rosy. But I think that given the level of threat and provocation, we are doing reasonably well. That's all I can say. I don't want to compare ourselves to others and to say we are doing better than the UK, we should teach them. That's not the case at all. And not the spirit of the things which I've tried to say.
You're very modest as always. Thank you so much. There is a discussion in the chat, but it wasn't actually described as a question, but I think it's very important to our discussion because we're dealing about democracy here. Some argued that, for instance, the question of Egypt with Mohammed Morsi's regime, the Muslim Brotherhood. To all of you, please, how do you describe, let's say, let's say the argument that the Western countries, let's say, sometimes they are not respecting democratic elections in regarding also to the terrorist threats from the perspective of what happened, let's say, in Egypt? Maybe you can add some comments about it, about the connection between democracy and terrorism in that aspect. Please, Professor Ben Dor, you will start. Then
I don't want to monopolize the discussion here. Maybe my fellow panelists would like to address this question first. I'm not going anyplace, but Ari would like to listen to the others as well. Actually, I'm going someplace because I have to shut the window because the rain is pouring in.
Maybe, Christian, you will start.
Okay, right. I mean, the case of Morsi is obviously a very, very peculiar case. So I don't want to extrapolate from one case to everything. But of course, from my knowledge, and somebody may correct me if I don't remember everything correctly, but from my knowledge of what happened was that Mohamed Morsi initially won the election. Now, whether we can call that a truly democratic election is another question, because of course it was the first time a competitive election was really held in Egypt at the time. I think it needs a little bit more to be fully democratic before then only calling it competitive, because of course democracy also is embedded with a number of different human rights that are also important, for instance, the freedom of speech and so on. And obviously, we did see that Mohamed Morsi also had some issues with that concept of freedom of speech. Another issue that we had, of course, was that Egypt went into an election with Mohamed Morsi not having had a fully written constitution. So we didn't know the principles of what exactly this new country was supposed to be. It had an election, then it had an outcome, and then it was developing a constitution. I don't know whether this was the best way of doing things. So that's another question. But I think it is to be said that, of course, that is a very peculiar and very specific case that applies primarily to Egypt. And of course, I have the impression that the Egyptian military was then starting to get Morsi was going with his discourse about rewriting the constitution and about all sorts of questions. But moving away just from the specific example of Egypt, moving into the larger arena in terms of democracies, I think we can say that despite all the flaws that democracies have, I think, was it maybe Churchill who at some point said it's still the best of all bad alternatives. So we may not be fully satisfied with every aspect, and it seems that in the current White House, President Trump is also not fully satisfied with all the alternatives, but it is the best alternative that we have at this point, and therefore it is what we need to pursue. And as such, we can see that even in the American context, even though there is discussion and debate about whether the election is solid and so on, we have a clear outcome, we have a winner, and we have a transition of government. And that is something that we see in all Western countries, as I cannot think of an example where this hasn't happened, but it is not something that we see outside that framework. So I don't want to dwell too much on this, but if we go into some transition democracies, we don't necessarily see that the winner necessarily, that the loser necessarily accepts the election. So with all the imperfections, it is still the best of all bad outcomes that we have. So I would leave it at that particular comment.
Professor Leonard, please, if you have any comments regarding this. Or
well, I'm not a specialist of Egypt, but when hearing perhaps not always supporting democracy and respecting electoral outcomes, yes, I would agree. If you look historically, there have been some cases. You can think of all the violence that started in Algeria and the role that some of the Western states had played in not accepting the result of the elections because of the parties that had won the elections at the time. So it is true that it is something that has happened. Yeah, that is true.
Professor Ben Dor, do you want to respond?
Yes. First, to the case of Egypt you cited. It voted Morsi into power, and it was the Egyptian people who threw him out. Nobody interfered in that. If anything, the Western countries, particularly the United States, pushed Mubarak out. They worked very hard to convince Mubarak to quit. And that was the election, which was reasonably fair. And people were voted into power, and Morsi was in power. Nobody interfered in what he did. He himself violated all the maxims of democracy, which Christian has alluded: freedom of speech, freedom of opposition, freedom of assembly, freedom of organization, free elections. So the Egyptians decided to throw him out. In general, as I said, to Egypt, there have been cases, as Sarah has just now said, that indeed the Western countries interfered in democratic processes, for instance, in Iran in the early 1950s under Mossadegh. There haven't been too many cases, but there have been some. I think in general, we should respect the integrity of each country to choose its own form of government. We should not impose democracy on anybody, and we should not overthrow somebody's democracy. We should protect our own. It's big enough. And I think that basically we should stick to that. As to the future of Egypt, I just want to say something optimistic. I think that eventually Egypt will become more democratic gradually, and perhaps will become a genuine democracy. The reason I'm saying it is that I can see a strong link between the strengths of the state and the ability to build a democratic form of government on the other. Egypt is a well-organized state with a central government, with a long tradition of national identity, a long tradition of obeying central government. And I think that Egypt is the most state-like Arab country. And in that sense, I think that Egypt has a strong middle class, also very active in social and political life. And eventually, I think the Egyptians will put their house in order. But I don't think anybody else should take part in this process other than the Egyptian people themselves.
Let's hope for more democracy in the Arab world, indeed. Another question, please. Very important question for all of you. In the light of the latest terrorist attacks in France and subsequently President Macron asking for the reforming the Schengen area, what effect will it have on the EU cooperation on terrorism? Please, maybe Sarah, you will start, and then Christian, or...
Well, every time there is a terrorist attack, there are discussions around the extent to which having open borders actually helps terrorists. And actually, if you look in detail at some terrorist attacks, it is true that in some cases, terrorists have been able to benefit from the fact that there are no border controls amongst the Schengen states to go from one country to another. At the same time, I think that Christian and then me as well in my presentation, we talked about all the instruments that the EU has put in place in order to actually compensate for this lifting of internal border control. So, you know, all these debates about Schengen, reforming Schengen have been rambling on. And I can't really imagine actually any major departure from actually what we have now. I think what we will see is that there will be more integration among states, and there will be more exchange of information, more instruments that are adopted to facilitate cooperation. And I can't really imagine that actually we will go kind of backwards and we will go back to introducing systematic checks at borders. But having said all that, it is true that actually terrorism and now the pandemic, so some situations have been used to actually reintroduce border controls for longer than should normally be happening. So there are some specific situations in which you can reintroduce border controls for some periods of time, and it is true that some states have been doing that for longer periods than probably what they should have done according to the spirit of the Schengen arrangements. But having said that, as I said, I really can't imagine that actually we're going to go backwards and having any major changes, because again, it's a little bit like what we were discussing earlier with those instruments. Schengen is a response to very concrete problems. There is so much traffic, well, not right now because of the pandemic, but in normal times, there's so much traffic of goods, so many people moving from one country to another, that it is really beneficial to lift the border controls actually. So yeah, I hope that answers the questions that, you know, transforming, reforming Schengen, but I don't think there will be any major departure from what has been done so far. If anything, I think there'll just be more integration in future. But perhaps Christian has another take on that question.
No, I fully agree. I think actually I want to give an example of how much of a benefit Schengen is, that it currently becomes a bargaining tool to threaten other countries with when they don't play ball with the pandemic. So what we're seeing at the moment is the discussion. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had those skiing holidays that started to spread the virus all across Europe, and one of the villages that was particularly affected as a super spreader was Ischgl, one of the Austrian skiing resorts that became a super spreader in the pandemic. Now, at the moment, there's a discussion in various continental countries, given that the numbers are going up, should we maybe forbid skiing holidays this year? Italy has already said we're going to stop that. There's not going to be any skiing holiday until at least sometime mid-January, possibly. Germany, and in particular Bavaria, has also said very strongly that they don't want that. They don't want any skiing holidays until at least later in January, because that would lead to super spreader events like Ischgl. And Austria has been saying that that would be a massive loss of revenue in terms of tourism, so they don't want that. And in return, the Bavarian Prime Minister said to Austria, well, we really want to keep the Schengen borders open, but you know, we might have to close them if you're not playing ball with this. And this is just to explain how important open borders are for all EU countries, because it would massively damage the economy of a lot of EU countries. And as a result of that, even threatening to close them is possibly already enough to get agreement on a number of different files. So what I think is happening when Macron, for instance, is threatening a Schengen reform is he's sending a signal to Italy in particular: don't send us any more refugees up to France. That is what he's really saying, because what we know is that a lot of them are coming through the Mediterranean, and of course a lot of them are then firstly embarking either in Greece or in Italy, and Italy has a very strong incentive to let them go north. And it is very well known, because they don't want to have such high numbers. They just let them go and let them pass and push them towards France. So in a sense, when Macron is talking about reforming Schengen, what he's talking is, you know, Italy, don't do that anymore, or we're going to do something as well. So this is not a serious attempt at reforming Schengen, because everybody's benefiting from Schengen to an extent, but this is a signal that he's sending politically towards Italy in particular.
Gabi, your comment, please, if you have.
I don't know anything about this, so I really should defer to my fellow panelists or experts on this. I can only introduce a little bit of controversy to make life more interesting in this panel discussion by saying the following. I am in touch with a large number of European intellectuals all the time. And until a year or two ago, I could find a total consensus that wide open boundaries are a good thing, Schengen is excellent, and so on and so forth. I'm stating very cautiously this is no longer the case. I can find some dissenting voices who say that some closed boundaries or some degree of perhaps retreat to what we had 3, 5, 10 years ago is not out of the question. That's all I can say. So there's a slight change in the mood about this question, but I really don't know much about it.
Thank you so much. The next question, and I guess will be the last because we are about to end. Is it true or false that the EU are playing a part in making the extradition of non-foreign criminals and terrorists difficult for the UK government and courts to be able to action because they are in fact blocking the UK through various legal stipulations within the UK's legal system for being able to action extradition of those that the UK see as a clear threat to the UK? A very long question. I'm sorry that since I won't give it verbatim. Maybe Christian, you will start, please.
All right. Do you have any chance to paraphrase it? Because I'm not entirely sure I understood the question.
Okay. There is an argument here that they're asking, is it true or false that the EU are playing a part in making the extradition of known foreign criminals and terrorists difficult for the UK government and courts to be able to action? Okay.
Okay, so it's a question whether the EU is making it harder for the UK to extradite. Okay.
Makes sense.
I think there I can quite clearly say that the legal basis is the opposite of that. The EU is in fact making it easier for terrorists to be extradited, and in fact the European arrest warrant is precisely what I was talking about, how between European countries, thanks to the European arrest warrant, extradition has become something that is an awful was in the past. In the past, an extradition of a terrorist or even a criminal, if you were going back to the framework of European conventions of the 1950s, would be something that could take, depending on which country you're talking about, something from 2 to 15 years, if it would happen at all. And in the EU context, 15 years went down to a couple of weeks. So that's how much that extradition has been made easier. Now, I think, if I'm interpreting the question rather than answering it literally, I think what the person might be asking is not whether the EU is making it harder, but whether the European Convention on Human Rights might be making it harder to extradite certain individuals. Now, first I need to say the European Convention on Human Rights is not part of the EU. It is in fact an international legal instrument that a lot of countries have adopted, a lot of European countries, even those that are outside the framework of the European Union. Turkey is, for instance, one of them. Russia is another one. So there is a number of different countries that are outside the framework of the European Union that are also part of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, it has been argued by some politicians that certain aspects of the European Convention on Human Rights could be making this harder. Now, so far, I haven't seen a convincing argument for that, because all I've seen is a case law that certain British judges that were interpreting the European Convention on Human Rights were then saying, well, these are the sort of things that cannot be done. It is important to point out that these are British judges that made this particular judgment. They were not European judges. So in that sense, even the European Convention on Human Rights, you could argue it's the British judges that were making it harder, not the European Convention on Human Rights. It's the British judges' interpretation of what that was. So even that argument, I don't find it wholly convincing. But I think the EU, the answer to me is clear. It's no. But even with the European Convention on Human Rights, the answer is ambiguous because, of course, it's British judges that made that judgment, not European judges. So at that point, I would say it's very ambiguous.
Sarah, please, your comments if you have.
Yes, I agree with Christian. Actually, if you look at the European arrest warrant for I think 32 categories of offenses. Now you no longer have this double criminality check. So in the past, you needed to have an offense being an offense in both countries in order to extradite someone, whereas now, as long as that that crime is on this list of these 32 serious crimes, then it happens automatically. So I can't see really how other EU member states could be hindering the UK. I agree with Christian that, yeah, there were all these debates around the extent to which the European Convention on Human Rights was sometimes used or misused by people representing you know, people that the UK wanted to send abroad. And so there were, you know, discussions, you may remember when May was she made, claiming that you can claim to have a cat in the UK and it's enough not to be removed. And I think that this is a big part of how the EU has been misconstrued. And like Christian said, the European Convention on Human Rights is an instrument of the Council of Europe. It's not even an instrument of the EU. So I think there's been a lot of confusion around these matters, which are indeed very complicated. But I think that on that specific question, no, I don't think that you can say that other EU member states would have hindered the extradition of criminals. Certainly with the European arrest warrant, it's really the other way around. It's much facilitated. And should the UK now have to fall back on the existing Council of Europe Convention, things will be much, much more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And before we end our great webinar today, I wish to thank, first of all of the speakers. Thank you so much. And of course, a special thanks to the woman behind the scenes, Joanna. Thank you so much, Dr. Joanna de Ferreira. Without you, I think that nothing would have been conducted here. Of our life, understanding about all those computers issues. Thank you so much. And we want, maybe Joanna, you want to say a few words also to remind everyone regarding our great event next month?
Oh, well, I can take, yes, this opportunity to remind you that we will have the launch of the Jean Monnet Research Network on EU Counter-Terrorism. It will be a 3-day event beginning on the 15th until the 17th of December. We have an absolutely stellar meeting with renowned academics, policymakers, practitioners. Of course, the themes will be around radicalization, terrorism, and counterterrorism. We will also have United Nations, Europol, European External Action, the head of Sahel mission, a very interesting panel on financing counterterrorism, a panel on gender and terrorism. So all the juicy and attractiveness in this research area. So I hope that you all register and spread the word. Actually, you can also replicate what happened here today and on the hashtags that I sent you by email, so that you can in fact enlarge the network that we want to start with this Jean Monnet. Thank you, Professor Ben Dor. Thank you, Ori and Mike and Sarah and Christian, for this incredible, absolutely fantastic lecture today. Professor Ben Dor, it was a pleasure to listen to you and to learn so much with your experience. It is a fact that some things come with experience, and you are a true embodiment of that. So thank you all, and I hope to see you in December. And once again, thank you. Bye. I'm now stopping the recording. If you wish to end and to say the goodbyes, and then I will end the recording.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Joanna.
Bye-bye. Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.